There is a man, sitting alone in a cold, dim room somewhere in the middle of the 19th century, an orphan boy who had been passed from one miserable farmhouse to another, who had known hunger before he knew comfort, who had felt the sting of rejection before he ever felt the warmth of belonging. He had every reason, every single logical reason, to believe that life owed him nothing, that peace was a luxury meant for people born into better circumstances, that plenty was a word that existed in other people's stories. And yet, this boy grew up to write some of the most life-changing words ever put on paper. His name was Orison Swett Marden, and the book he gave the world, Peace, Power, and Plenty, is not just a collection of nice ideas. It is a map, drawn by someone who walked through the darkest valleys and came out the other side carrying light. This book carries a single, enormous truth underneath all its pages, and that truth is this: the life you are living on the outside is a mirror, a faithful and honest mirror, of what is happening on the inside. Your thoughts are not passengers along for the ride. They are the driver. They set the course, they press the accelerator, they decide whether you move towards sunlight or stay parked in shadow. And once you truly understand that, not just hear it but feel it in your chest, everything changes. Marden opens the book with an almost urgent tenderness, like someone who has watched too many people suffer needlessly and cannot stay quiet any longer. He looks at the world around him and sees people chasing peace as if it were hiding somewhere outside them, in a bigger house, in a better job, in another city, in a different relationship. And he wants to grab every one of them by the shoulders, gently but firmly, and say, "You are looking in the wrong direction. Peace is not out there. It was never out there. It is a condition of the mind, a habit of the soul, and the moment you stop chasing it and start cultivating it, your whole life shifts." He talks about how most people carry their troubles the way some people carry a heavy coat in summer. They are sweating, they are uncomfortable, they are slowing themselves down, and yet they will not put it down. Why? Because they have become so used to the weight that they mistake it for reality. They think this is just what life feels like. They have normalized the tension, the anxiety, the low-grade dread that sits in the stomach every morning. Marden says, "No, that is not life. That is a habit. And habits can be changed." The way he talks about the mind is so ahead of his time that reading him now feels less like reading a century-old book and more like reading something written by someone who understood what science would take decades to confirm. He understood that the mind and the body speak the same language. He knew that a person who constantly thinks thoughts of fear and worry is not just mentally troubled, they are physically affected. The worried mind creates a worried body. The anxious thought becomes the tense shoulder, the clenched jaw, the shallow breath, the sleepless night. He was not guessing. He was observing. And what he observed led him to one of the most powerful invitations ever extended to a human being. Choose your thoughts as carefully as you would choose the food you put in your body, because both become you. There is a story that lives somewhere in the spirit of this book, even if Marden does not tell it in exactly these words. Imagine two farmers, side by side, same land, same weather, same tools, same season. One of them wakes up every morning dreading the day, certain the rain will ruin the crops, certain the market will drop, certain that effort is pointless because fate has already decided against him. The other wakes up and, even on hard mornings, holds a quiet, stubborn faith that something good is growing, that the work matters, that the soil responds to care. At the end of the year, it is not the rain that separates their harvests. It is the orientation of their minds, the silent daily vote they cast about what kind of world they are living in. Marden would look at that story and nod slowly, because he understood that what you expect, with genuine conviction, begins to arrange itself around you. This is where his idea of mental atmosphere becomes so compelling. He talks about how every person carries a kind of invisible climate with them wherever they go. Some people walk into a room and something lifts. There is a warmth and ease, a sense that things are going to be all right. Other people walk in and the temperature seems to drop a degree or two, not because of anything they say, but because of something they radiate. That radiation is not mysterious. It is the accumulated output of their habitual thinking. It is what happens when a mind has been marinating in fear or bitterness or suspicion for years. It seeps out. It creates a field around the person. And here is the difficult but freeing truth. Most people are not aware they are doing it. They think they are just being realistic. They think they are just being cautious. But Marden says, no, you have confused realism with pessimism, and that confusion is costing you more than you know. He is not asking anyone to pretend the world has no difficulties. He is not the kind of writer who tells you to smile while your house is burning down. He has too much respect for human experience to do that. What he is saying is something more nuanced and more useful. The difficulty exists, and how you hold it in your mind determines whether it breaks you or builds you. You can hold a hard thing with fear, or you can hold it with courage. Both are a choice. One weakens you, one strengthens you, and the choice, made 100 times a day in small moments, shapes the character of your entire life. One of the most striking things about this book is how Marden treats peace not as passivity but as power. We often think of a peaceful person as someone who is somehow removed from the intensity of life, someone who has retreated to some quiet corner where nothing much happens. Marden flips that completely. He says the most powerful people, the ones who accomplish real things, who create lasting work, who build something meaningful, are the ones who have peace as their foundation. Because peace is not the absence of energy, it is the absence of waste. A person at war with themselves, a person whose mind is a battlefield of anxiety and self-doubt, bleeds energy constantly. They spend enormous amounts of mental and emotional fuel just staying upright. They have very little left for actual creation, actual connection, actual living. The peaceful mind, on the other hand, is efficient. It does not hemorrhage its resources into fear. It can direct its full force toward what matters. Think about the people you have known in your own life, the ones who seem to get things done effortlessly, who move through challenges without falling apart, who could focus when everything around them was chaotic. You probably remember them as calm people. Not cold, not detached, but calm. That calm was not weakness. It was discipline. It was the practiced art of refusing to let every passing storm set up permanent residence in the mind. Marden describes this as one of the highest achievements a human being can reach. Not fame, not wealth, not status, but the mastery of one's own inner climate. He also writes beautifully about the relationship between thought and health. And here again, he was drawing conclusions that felt radical in his day but feel almost obvious now. He believed, with real conviction, that worry was one of the great enemies of the human body, that the person who has learned to release anxiety, to stop catastrophizing, to let go of the things beyond their control, is actually doing something profoundly physical. They are giving their nervous system a rest. They are allowing their body to heal and restore in ways that constant tension prevents. He had watched people age before their time under the weight of unnecessary worry. He had seen vitality drain from perfectly healthy bodies because the mind would not stop racing toward imaginary disasters. And he wanted people to understand that this was not just a spiritual matter. It was a practical one. Your mental habits have biological consequences. This idea connects to one of the most important threads running through the whole book, the idea that plenty, real abundance, begins in the mind before it appears in the world. Marden writes about poverty with great compassion, but also with great honesty. He distinguishes between poverty that comes from circumstances beyond a person's control and poverty that is perpetuated by a poverty mindset, a way of thinking that has become so convinced of scarcity that it cannot recognize opportunity even when it is standing in plain view. He is not blaming poor people. He is identifying a pattern of thought that can trap anyone, rich or poor, and pointing out that the first and most important step toward a different life is a different way of seeing. He describes men and women he had observed who seemed to carry lack with them like a shadow. No matter how their external circumstances shifted, they remained in a state of psychological scarcity. And then he describes others who seemed to carry abundance the same way, people who were not necessarily wealthy by the world's standards, but who had a richness of spirit, a sense of sufficiency, a belief that life was fundamentally generous, and who, not surprisingly, tended to find opportunities and resources flowing toward them in ways that puzzled the people around them. Marden says, "This is not luck. This is alignment." When the mind genuinely believes in abundance, it starts to see what the scarcity mind filters out. It starts to move differently. It starts to attract what it expects. Now, around this point in the book, Marden begins to really dig into what he calls the power of affirmation, the practice of deliberately holding certain thoughts and certain beliefs in the mind, even and especially when external evidence seems to argue against them. This is not self-deception. This is not pretending. This is the strategic planting of seeds in the soil of the mind before the harvest has arrived. A farmer does not wait to see corn before he plants the seed. He plants the seed in faith, in expectation, in alignment with a process he trusts. Marden says the mind works the same way. You plant the thought of health and you nurture it, and you refuse to water the thought of sickness. You plant the thought of capability and you tend it, and you refuse to indulge the thought of helplessness. He talks about self-talk in a way that is so modern it is almost jarring. He understood that the voice inside a person's head, the running commentary that most people barely notice, is one of the most powerful forces in their lives. He saw people who narrated themselves into corners, who described themselves as unlucky, as slow, as unworthy of good things, and then seemed genuinely confused when unlucky, slow, unworthy experiences kept finding them. And he saw others who held themselves in a kind of quiet, internal regard, who spoke to themselves with patience and possibility, and who carried that inner conversation into every room they entered, every challenge they faced, every relationship they built. The inner voice becomes the outer life. Not immediately, not magically, but surely, the way water shapes stone. There is something in this book about the dignity of aspiration that moves me every time I encounter it. Marden believed, in his bones, that every human being carries within them a seed of greatness, not greatness in the flashy, famous sense, but greatness in the sense of becoming fully what one is capable of becoming, of living a life that is genuinely one's own, of bringing one's real gifts into real contact with the real world. He had no patience for the smallness that comes from fear. He had no tolerance for the self-diminishment that comes from listening too long to the voices that say you are not enough. He had walked too hard a road to waste time on that kind of shrinking, and he wanted the reader to feel the same urgency, the same refusal to settle for a muted version of the life they were meant to live. If you are listening to this right now, and somewhere in the back of your mind there is a dream you have been postponing, a version of yourself you have been saving for someday, a capability you have been afraid to claim, this book is speaking directly to you. Marden would tell you that someday is not a day on the calendar, it is a decision, and the decision is always available. Not the decision to have everything figured out, not the decision to have no more fear, but the decision to move anyway, to think anyway, to hold the vision anyway, even when the evidence has not caught up yet. He writes with such warmth about ordinary people who made extraordinary shifts simply by changing how they thought about themselves and their possibilities. A woman who had spent years believing she had no talent, who discovered that the belief itself was the cage, and not any absence of ability. A man who had failed in business twice, and who, instead of concluding that failure was his destiny, chose to see failure as instruction, re-entered, and built something lasting on the foundation of what the first two attempts had taught him. Marden loved these stories because they proved the principle he was writing about, not in theory, in life. One of the chapters that stays with a reader long after the book is closed deals with what Marden calls the poison of negative emotion, particularly resentment, envy, and chronic complaint. He treats these not as moral failings but as practical disasters. He is not judging the person who feels resentful. He understands how resentment forms. He knows what injustice feels like. But he makes a distinction that is sharp and important. Feeling an emotion and choosing to marinate in it are two different things. The person who feels anger and moves through it is not the same as the person who sets up a home in anger and rents out all the rooms. The first is human. The second is corrosive. He is particularly pointed about envy, and rightly so, because envy is one of the most socially acceptable forms of self-destruction. We dress it up as fairness, we call it inequality, and sometimes, yes, the external things we call unfair really are unfair. But Marden is talking about something more internal, the habitual tendency to measure one's own life against another person's life, and feel diminished by the comparison. He says this habit of mind is like drinking poison and expecting the other person to get sick. The person you are envious of is unaffected. You are the one being consumed. And the energy you are pouring into comparison is energy that could be pouring into creation. This connects to something he says about complaint that I think deserves a moment of real attention. Marden was not anti-conversation, not opposed to honest expressions of difficulty, but he was deeply skeptical of chronic complaining, of the habit of narrating one's life primarily through what is wrong, what is lacking, what is unfair. He had noticed, in himself and in others, that complaint becomes a lens. Once you start looking at life through that lens, everything looks like something to complain about. Not because everything is bad, but because the lens filters for badness and screens out everything else. And you end up living in a version of reality that is technically accurate in its details, but wildly distorted in its overall picture, a portrait of a life painted only in shadows. He offers an alternative that is not toxic positivity, but genuine reorientation. He suggests the practice of deliberately, consciously, regularly noticing what is working, what is beautiful, what is moving in the right direction, not as a denial of what is hard, but as a counterbalance to the mind's natural tendency to fixate on threat. He calls this the gratitude orientation, and he describes it not as a feeling, but as a practice, something you do even when you do not feel like it, something you build into the architecture of your days until it becomes the default setting of your mind. Somewhere around this place in the journey through the book, there is a passage that I think is one of the most honest and quietly radical things Marden ever wrote. He says that most people are not unhappy because of what has happened to them. They are unhappy because of what they tell themselves about what has happened to them. This is a statement that, if you let it land fully, asks a great deal of you, because it means that the story you are telling about your life is a choice, even when the events themselves were not. The events happened, but the meaning you attach to them, the narrative you build around them, the role you assign yourself within them, that is yours. You are the author of that part, and you can revise. Marden talks about people who had genuinely devastating experiences, loss, betrayal, failure on a scale that would make most of us fold, and who somehow came through not just intact, but enlarged. Not because they did not suffer, they did, but because they refused to let the suffering write the final sentence of their story. They held on to something, a sense of forward motion, a faith in their own resilience, a belief that the chapter they were in was not the whole book. and that holding on, that refusal to be defined by the worst thing that had happened, was itself a form of power. The kind of power that no circumstance can give you and no circumstance can take away. This is the power Marden is really writing about throughout the whole book, not the power of position or privilege or force, the power of a fully inhabited self, the power that comes from knowing, in the quiet self, who you are and what you are capable of and what you are here to do. He calls it the power that comes from alignment between the inner life and the outer action, and he says it is available to every human being regardless of where they started. He spends a good portion of the book addressing work and purpose, because he understood that a person without a sense of purpose is a person whose inner life is poorly organized, no matter how busy they appear on the outside. He had seen people who were enormously industrious but also strangely hollow, who worked constantly but could not tell you why, who accumulated things but did not feel richer. And he had seen others who worked with a kind of joyful intensity, who were doing what they felt made for, and who radiated a quality of aliveness that filled every room they entered. The difference was not talent. The difference was alignment. One group was doing what they thought they should do. The other was doing what they were. He writes about the finding of one's work, one's real work, with a reverence that is almost like writing about a spiritual calling. And in a sense, he believed it was. He believed that each person carries a particular kind of contribution that only they can make, a specific shape of gift that fits a specific space in the world, and that the journey toward that contribution is one of the central purposes of a human life. He did not think this was precious or unrealistic. He thought it was eminently practical. A person doing their real work does not exhaust themselves the way a person grinding through work that is wrong for them does. A person in alignment produces more, sustains more, gives more, and recovers more easily. He also addresses the relationship between generosity and abundance in a way that cuts against every scarcity-minded instinct. He argues, with evidence drawn from observation rather than sentiment, that the most abundantly lived lives are almost always characterized by a spirit of giving, of contribution, of adding something to the world rather than simply extracting from it. He's not talking about giving away what you cannot afford to give. He's talking about an orientation, a default setting of the soul that asks, how can I be useful here? How can I add something here? What can I bring to this situation? He says that people who ask these questions consistently, even in small moments, seem to move through the world differently. Doors open for them that remain closed for people who are always calculating what they can get. There is a beautiful section in the book about friendship and human connection that I think often gets overlooked in summaries because it feels softer than the material about success and power. But Marden takes it very seriously. He understood that no amount of inner work happens in isolation, that we are shaped by the people we spend our lives around, that the company we keep is a form of environment, just like the physical environment, and that it affects us whether we are conscious of it or not. He talks about the nourishing quality of good friendships, relationships where you are genuinely seen, where there is real warmth, where honesty and kindness coexist. And he talks about the quietly corrosive quality of relationships built on cynicism or competition or mutual diminishment, the kind where you always come away feeling a little less than you were before. He did not say walk away from everyone who is struggling. He was not that cold. But he did say pay attention. Pay attention to how you feel after time with different people. Pay attention to whether a relationship is drawing out your best or feeding your worst. Pay attention to whether the conversations you are part of are moving towards something, or cycling endlessly around complaint and gossip and fear. Because these things matter. Not as moral judgments about other people, but as practical information about your own inner environment. Around the 10-minute mark of genuinely sitting with this book, something shifts in the reader. It stops feeling like advice and starts feeling like a conversation between two people who both understand what it is to struggle and what it is to try. Marden never writes from a position of having figured it all out. He writes from a position of having walked through enough difficulty to have real respect for difficulty, and from having discovered, through that walk, that there are principles at work in human life that reward attention and application. He is not selling you a shortcut. He is pointing toward a path. And if you are still with this, still listening, still here, we want to pause and just say, if this kind of content speaks to you, if these ideas feel like something you want more of in your life, please consider liking this video and subscribing to Audiobook Library. Every like and subscription genuinely helps the channel grow, helps more people find content like this, and helps us keep bringing these transformative books to you. It costs nothing and means everything. So please, if this has been valuable, take a moment and support the channel before we continue. Now, back to where we were, because there is so much more in this book worth exploring. Marden has a great deal to say about courage, and his treatment of it is not the chest-thumping, fearless hero version that so often fills the shelves of motivational literature. His courage is quieter, and in some ways more demanding. It is the courage to think differently than the crowd. It is the courage to hold a vision when no one around you can see it yet. It is the courage to begin when the outcome is uncertain, which it always is. It is the courage to fail in public and continue anyway. He says that most people do not lack courage in the dramatic sense. They've never had to run into a burning building or stand in the path of something that could kill them. But they lack the quieter, more daily courage, the courage to be fully themselves, to speak their real convictions, to pursue their real dreams, to risk the small embarrassments and rejections that come with actually trying. He makes a point that is so simple it should not be as overlooked as it is. The people who live with the most regret are not usually the ones who tried and failed. They are the ones who never tried. The failure is loud and immediate. The regret is quiet and permanent. And somewhere in the accumulation of not trying, a person loses something harder to name than an opportunity. They lose a piece of their sense of what is possible for themselves. Each time you do not take the step looks bigger and more impossible. Each time you do take it, even if you fall, you have confirmed that you are someone who can take steps. This matters deeply in the context of what Marden calls the building of character. He talks about character not as a quality you either have or you do not as something assigned at birth, but as something built, brick by brick, decision by decision, over the course of a life. And the decisions that build character most powerfully are not the grand ones, not the heroic public moments, but the small private ones. The moment when you could cut a corner and choose not to. The moment when you could lie and choose truth. The moment when you could take the easy path and choose the right one instead. Each of these moments is a deposit into the account of who you are. And over time, the account either grows into something you can draw on with confidence, or it stays empty and leaves you feeling, as Marden puts it, hollow at the center, unable to trust yourself in ways that matter. He also tackles one of the great obstacles to personal growth with unusual directness, the fear of what other people think. He understood that this fear is one of the most powerful forces shaping human behavior, more powerful than most people want to admit. People choose careers they do not want because of it. They stay in situations that diminish them because of it. They silence the parts of themselves that are most alive because of it. And Marden says, gently but clearly, that this is one of the saddest ways to spend a human life. Living according to other people's expectations, not because you have examined those expectations and found them to be wise, but simply because you are afraid of disapproval, is a form of imprisonment. And the jailer is not anyone outside you. The jailer is the part of you that has handed that much authority to the crowd. He is not recommending carelessness about other people. He deeply values relationships, community, mutual responsibility. But he distinguishes between the desire to be genuinely good to others and the compulsive need for approval from others. The first is love. The second is fear wearing love's clothing. And only you can tell which one is driving on any given day. There is a portion of the book that I find particularly relevant to the world we are all living in now, which is Marden's analysis of how people respond to adversity. He identifies two fundamentally different postures that a person can take when hard things happen. The first is what he calls the reactive posture, where the event determines the response, where what happens on the outside controls what happens on the inside, where the person is essentially at the mercy of circumstances. The second is what he calls the responsive posture, where the person, even in the middle of difficulty, retains some inner authority, some capacity to choose how they will meet what is happening. He is not saying that the responsive person does not feel the difficulty. They feel it fully, but they do not surrender the authorship of their inner life to it. He talks about resilience in a way that makes it feel like something you can actually build rather than something you just hope you have when you need it. Resilience, in his view, is not toughness in the sense of not feeling. It is suppleness in the sense of not breaking. The rigid tree snaps in the storm. The tree with roots that go deep and branches that can bend, that tree survives, not because it avoided the wind, but because it was prepared for it. And what prepares a person for the storms of life is not isolation from difficulty, but the consistent practice of meeting small difficulties with courage and curiosity, building the evidence, one experience at a time, that you can face what comes and not be destroyed by it. He also writes, with great insight about the role of enthusiasm in a human life. Not the manufactured enthusiasm of a performance, not the forced positivity that has no root, but the deep natural enthusiasm that arises when a person is connected to something that genuinely matters to them. He says this quality, this aliveness in relation to one's work and one's purpose, is one of the most attractive and one of the most productive forces a person can develop. Enthusiastic people are not performing excitement. They are expressing connection. And that connection communicates itself to everyone around them. It pulls other people in, it creates momentum, it makes things possible that the merely dutiful approach cannot produce. He makes a lovely distinction between doing something because you have to and doing it because you choose to, and he says that the same action, performed from these two different orientations, produces radically different results, not just in the quality of the output, but in the quality of the experience of the person doing it. The person who shows up to their work with a sense of choiceness, a sense of this is where I want to be, what I want to give, who I want to become. That person is having a fundamentally different experience of their life than the person dragging themselves through obligations they resent. And the difference is mostly internal. It is a shift in relationship to the same actions. He extends this to relationships and says something that I think is rarely said as clearly as he says it. Love, genuine love, is a choice made and remade every day, not a feeling that arrives and stays without maintenance. The people who have the most beautiful long relationships are not the ones who got lucky in finding the right person and then sat back and let love take care of itself. They are the ones who chose to love, in the active and daily sense, who brought their full attention and generosity to the relationship consistently, who treated the other person as someone worth showing up for on Tuesday mornings when neither of them felt particularly romantic or heroic. This is not a poetic notion. It is a practical one. Love that is not actively expressed and tended diminishes, and the diminishment is gradual enough that people often do not notice until something important is gone. Marden talks about the relationship between sleep, rest, and the quality of thought in a way that reflects his deep attention to the connection between the physical and the mental. He was ahead of his time in recognizing that the depleted mind cannot think clearly, cannot hold the higher thoughts of peace and abundance and possibility, cannot resist the pull of fear and complaint, that the person who is chronically exhausted is fighting their battles with a handicapped general. He advocated for rest, real rest. Not just the absence of work, but the genuine restoration of the nervous system, the quiet that allows the deeper mind to process and integrate and emerge refreshed. He believed in the outdoor world as a restorative, in the capacity of nature to recalibrate something in the human nervous system that the artificial environments of industry and commerce constantly disturb. He had noticed that people who maintain some regular connection to natural spaces, to open air and growing things and the unmanaged rhythms of the living world, seem to carry a different quality of calm in them, a steadiness that people confined entirely to human-built environments often lacked. This was not romanticism. This was observation, the same careful observation that colored everything he wrote. There is a chapter that deals specifically with what Marden calls the habit of success, and it is worth spending time with because it challenges some of our most comfortable assumptions about what success actually is. He does not define it by outcome. He defines it by orientation. A person in the habit of success is a person who approaches their work and their life with a consistent set of mental and emotional practices, attention, care, the refusal to accept slovenly or careless output, the willingness to do the thing again if the first attempt was not worthy of their standard. This is not perfectionism in the paralyzing sense. It is craftsmanship in the deepest sense, the love of doing something well not for external recognition, but because doing things well is an expression of who you are. He tells stories or alludes to the lives of men and women he had known or read about, who built great things not because they were smarter or luckier than everyone else, but because they had this habit. They brought their full selves to whatever they were doing. They did not save their best for the important moments through the ordinary ones. They understood that the ordinary moments, the daily practice, the Monday morning when no one is watching, that is where character is formed and capacity is built. The great moment comes to the person who has been living well in the small moments. It finds them ready. He also has something very wise to say about failure, which is that most people waste it. They experience failure as pure loss, pure humiliation, something to escape from and forget as quickly as possible. But Marden says that failure is information, and expensive information, honestly purchased at a real cost, and therefore doubly worth reading carefully. What did this tell you about your approach? What did it reveal about your preparation? What did it clarify about your understanding of the terrain you are moving through? The person who asks these questions emerges from failure different than they entered it. They emerge carrying something forward. The person who simply runs from failure carries nothing forward and is doomed to pay the same tuition again. He takes care to address the difference between healthy ambition and destructive ambition, because he knew that ambition untethered from values becomes something that devours the person carrying it. He had seen men and women sacrifice their health, their relationships, their integrity, in pursuit of a success that when it arrived felt like nothing at all, because the self that had wanted it had been hollowed out in the pursuit. Real ambition, in Marden's view, is always connected to something larger than personal gain. It is animated by a genuine desire to contribute, to build something that matters, to leave some corner of the world better than you found it. When ambition has that quality, it is sustaining. It fills rather than empties. It moves toward life rather than away from it. This leads to one of his central meditations on meaning, on what makes a human life feel worthwhile not in the retrospective look back, but in the daily living of it. He says, meaning is not found, it is made, and it is made in the space between what you value and what you do. When those two things are aligned, when how you spend your days reflects what you actually care about most. Something lights up in the human experience that is recognizable, even from the outside. People can see when another person is living meaningfully. There is a quality to them that has nothing to do with their bank account or their title or their accomplishments. It is a quality of at-homeness, of rightness, of being exactly where they are supposed to be doing exactly what they are supposed to be doing. Marden believed this was available to everyone. He did not think it required exceptional talent or extraordinary circumstances. He thought it required courage, the courage to be honest with yourself about what you really value, and commitment, the commitment to make choices that reflect those values even when other choices would be easier or more immediately rewarded. He was not naive about the constraints that real lives come with. He knew that people had bills and responsibilities and limitations, but he also knew that even within constraints there is always some move toward alignment available. Not the whole journey in one step, but one step and then another. He talks about what he calls the seed principle, which is one of the most quietly powerful ideas in the book. Every large thing begins as a small thing. Every harvest begins as a seed. And the seed requires care before it shows any visible signs of becoming what it will become. This is where most people give up. They plant the seed and then, because they cannot see anything happening, they conclude nothing is happening and they dig it up and they plant something else or they plant nothing. But Marden says the invisible period is not an inactive period. The most essential work is happening underground in the dark before the first shoot appears. Faith in the process means continuing to water, to tend, to protect the soil, even when the visible evidence has not yet arrived. He applies this principle to every area of life, to the building of skill, to the development of character, to the growth of relationships, to the accumulation of resources. In every case, there is a period of invisible work, of investment that has not yet shown its return, of seeds that are growing without yet being seen. The people who break through that period and keep going are the ones who eventually see the harvest. The people who demand immediate visible evidence are always digging up their seeds. There is something in this book about the power of silence and stillness that I want to linger on, because it is easy to rush past. Marden lived in an era before the internet, before the relentless stream of noise that modern life produces, and yet he already understood that people were letting the external world crowd out the inner one. He advocated for daily periods of genuine quiet, not just the absence of noise, but the active cultivation of stillness, the practice of sitting with oneself long enough to hear what is happening below the surface of the day's demands. He believed that the still mind, the mind that has learned to be quiet, has access to a quality of intelligence, and a quality of creativity that the constantly busy mind can never reach. He was essentially describing what we would now call a contemplative practice, and he was recommending it not as a spiritual luxury, but as a practical necessity for anyone who wanted to think clearly, choose well, and live fully. He said that many of the best decisions he had ever seen people make were not made in the midst of frantic activity. They were made in the aftermath of stillness, when the noise had settled enough for the deeper knowing to speak. This brings him, toward the end of his great investigation into what makes for a genuinely well-lived life, to something that might be called the integration of all the threads he has been weaving. He describes the person who has, over time and through practice and through the willingness to keep learning from experience, arrived at a certain quality of inner freedom. Not freedom from difficulty, not freedom from effort, not freedom from the ordinary demands of a human life, but freedom within it. The freedom that comes from knowing your own mind. The freedom that comes from having values you actually live by. The freedom that comes from not needing the world to be something other than what it is in order to be at peace. This person is not perfect. Marden had no interest in the perfection myth. This person still makes mistakes, still struggles, still faces mornings when the weight of things feels heavy. But they have developed, through years of inner work, a kind of center of gravity that does not shift every time the wind changes. They are, in the truest sense, themselves. And that selfhood, that genuine inhabitation of their own life, is the greatest achievement Marden can imagine for a human being. He closes with something that reads almost like a blessing, a wish for the reader that is so warm and so generous that it reminds you this was written by someone who had been genuinely poor, genuinely alone, genuinely without, and who turned all of that into fuel for something larger than himself. He wishes for you peace, not the peace of someone who has given up, but the peace of someone who has made their choices and is living by them. He wishes for you power, not the power of domination, but the power of a fully inhabited self moving through the world with clarity and purpose. And he wishes for you plenty, not just of material things, but of the things that material abundance can never substitute for: time that feels well spent, relationships that feel genuinely nourishing, work that feels genuinely yours, a life that feels, at the end of the day, like something you actually lived. Not a program, not a system, not a set of techniques, a way of seeing, a set of lenses through which to look at your own life and recognize, perhaps for the first time, how much of it is yours to choose. Marden wrote this in 1909, and yet reading it now, in a world that is faster and louder and more complex in its anxieties than anything he could have imagined, the essential message has not aged a day, because the human soul has not changed. The tendency to chase peace outside ourselves is as old as time. The confusion of activity with meaning, as old as time. The hunger for genuine connection, for real purpose, for a life that feels larger than the sum of its obligations, as old as time. And the answer, the patient, quiet, demanding, beautiful answer that Marden spent his whole life pointing toward, that has not changed either. Start with a thought, choose it carefully, tend it faithfully, let it grow into a life that looks like it belongs to you because it does. What a privilege it is to sit with a book like this. What a privilege it is to have been given access to the accumulated wisdom of a man who refused to let hardship close his heart, who kept his eyes wide open to the possibility of human flourishing, who believed so completely in the potential of every person who picked up his pages that the belief still reaches across more than a century to find you, here, wherever you are, in whatever chapter of your own story you are currently living. Take what rings true, leave what does not. But do not leave without something. Because there is something here for you. There is always something here for the person willing to look. And with that, as you carry this into your day, your week, your life, we want to say thank you for spending this time here with us. If this summary moved something in you, if it reminded you of something you already knew but needed to hear again, please take a moment to like this video. It is a small gesture, but it makes a real difference in helping this channel reach the people who need it. Subscribe to Audiobook Library if you have not already, because we have a whole library of summaries just like this one, books that have the power to shift your thinking, widen your perspective, and remind you of what you are truly capable of. And please, do explore our other videos. There are summaries waiting for you on this channel that might just be the exact thing you needed to find today. We pour care into every one of them. We hope it shows. Thank you for being here. See you in the next one.